Welcome back. Here we have Module 3, Residential Schools. I like to start every module with a quote. So this is from the Truth and Reconciliation Report. Again, if you're at all interested in that, I would look up anything by Murray Sinclair because he was the chair of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he just has such an incredible wealth of knowledge, and anything from this TRC report as well has a lot of background information, and their website is full of resources. So too many Canadians know little or nothing about the deep historical roots of these conflicts. This lack of knowledge has serious consequences for First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, and for Canada. And that's taken from their report. And I can speak a little bit about that as well, because last September 2017, I taught a course at Brock University. So majority of my students were in that age range of just out of high school or like early 20s. And when we started to get into this, I just kind of assumed that in 2017, that these students would have heard of this, especially with the lead singer there from that passed away, Gord Downey, and all the things that came from the work that he's been doing with the Wenjack Foundation and all of that prominence, and the TRC. I just thought that they would know, but there were probably a good handful of maybe about at least 5 or 6 students that had never heard of this before, and they graduated from the region, like from Niagara region, St. Catharines, Niagara Falls, and said, we were never taught this, or they just had no clue, or said, I don't know, maybe I wasn't in school that day, but they didn't have a clue. And I was like, wow, that's pretty mind-boggling. So that really, again, I'm a sociology major, and so that's why I always, when I do this type of training, I always get people to look at the bigger picture, because that's the sociology nerd in me. So again, when I hear statements like that from recent high school grads saying that, I think, wow, that education system has got to change. Because if they're graduating at this time and saying those things, then clearly that's an epic fail, right? So, and it was disheartening with Doug Ford coming in and canceling all of the new updates to the curriculum to include the TRC recommendations and to try to bridge some of those gaps and help the teachers so that they can have accurate, clear, and amazing resources to include within our schools to fill those gaps. And that comes right from that report from the TRC recommendations, that these are the things that we recommend, and it's very clearly outlined. Those, I believe there's 94 of them. So to have a provincial government then have the power to step in and say, no, we don't want that. Just kidding. We really don't have any time or need for the truth. So how can we get to the next phase of reconciliation if the truth piece isn't even there? We'll just continue to pump out graduates that have no clue of this very important part of Canadian history, right? So it's very, very interesting times politically right now to see where things go, and especially with the federal government. And yeah, it's really interesting. I always try to stay on top of political shifts and how it's relating to Indigenous people, because it's just sometimes it is mind-boggling to see how things are still viewed and how we are still treated in today's society by the government. But that's a whole nother training module altogether. So getting back on track to residential schools. So again, brief historical overview, the purpose of the schools, and systemic approach to colonization. It's pretty standard. I think I do all of my modules in a similar way. So again, here's our beautiful diagram here, a historical timeline. So before this colonization occurred, before there were contact with a lot of settlers, again, we did have that civilization intact. So we had that sustainability as well, because we were connected to the land. When you live off of the land in order to survive, that's your livelihood. So you have an intense connection to the land. You know all of the signs, what the weather change brings. It's like there's a whole science that goes into being connected to the land and knowing when to plant, knowing when to, store your seeds, when to, take care of those crops, and, how weather is going to damage things, when is the time to hunt and when is the time not to hunt. There's a whole science behind just that piece of being connected to the land. And we were, because we survived that way for many generations. So we have a family, social, and political systems that were also intact. We had that civilization was there, and we worked together to achieve what we needed to. So that was before. During that whole colonization process, and again, this is your Reader's Digest version, there was, I think one of the biggest impacts of that colonization was the loss of autonomy. In my opinion, when I kind of did this overview and working with clients as I have over the past 15 years and helping them with their healing and going through that whole phase of whatever it is that they need to take care of, there's such a historical loss there of that autonomy from being free and open and connected to the land and being able to move with the cycles if we need it to move, to help that land to regenerate because of the farming processes for sustainability, or drought or whatever the situation. We had that autonomy to listen to the land, to listen to, are we able to sustain a move at this time? Then is it a good choice, or a good decision for our village? Then yes, it is. Then we're able to just go if we needed to go and follow that instinct to be connected to the land and to ourselves, right? So that losing that autonomy is a deep loss, and as well as the disconnection from the land base. It kind of already talked about that, and that way of life, particularly if you have many students that came to our local residential school, which was in Brantford, which was known as the Mush Hole. Many of those students came from far, like northern Quebec, like James Bay Cree area, like quite a far distance away. And at that time, even now, in recent years, like many of their people there are still living off of the land. They're still deeply connected to the moose, to the geese, and following those animals as a way to help, for their livelihood, their sustenance, and all of that. And that's what they base their way of life on. And their main language, their first language is still Cree in many of those communities. And so because they're a little bit more isolated, so they don't have such of an impact of colonization as we do here in the South. So that's nice. It was really nice to see that when I visited Waswanipi, how everybody speaks Cree. They're actually trilingual. They speak Cree first, French second, and English is very broken. But so that was pretty cool to see. So yeah, if you have people coming from that lifestyle and that way of life, and they're living deeply embedded into that land, and the language and living off of the trap line, living in the bush, all of a sudden they come into residential school where it's a completely foreign way of life. That is a complete and total culture shock, and they cannot leave. They cannot leave and go home, like versus somebody that might have been coming to Brantford and lived at Six Nations. There would have been a fair chance that they could have gotten away and went home, or somebody would have taken them in because they're close by, you know, versus you can't go home if you're from northern Quebec. You're not going to make it. And that's where we get into those cases like the Windjack, sorry, I forget his name right now, boy, when he tried to run away and died. And so many other people had that similar story, especially in the States, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Their residential school was quite notorious. It was actually run by the military, and they were very notorious for having people run away and die on. There were a certain train tracks that led into that area, and a lot of kids froze trying to escape, you know. So it was just a crazy, crazy experience, and very traumatic for children to go through this. We're not talking adults, we're talking children. So to have them go through that process is just, for me, it's very emotional. It's very emotional because you just think of the pain, the generational pain, and the hurt and the trauma. It's really intense. It's very heavy, right? But that's the reality of what happened. So that was during that dark phase. After that, we have the intergenerational impacts. Now we have the trauma, loss, and grief that I was speaking about. That's all there. But as a way to cope with that, because many people coming out of that residential school had what we now know of as PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Or stress, sorry, I had to think of what that stood for a minute there. Post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's debilitating. It's very debilitating. And of course, back then, when people were coming out in those eras and trying to integrate back into society, those resources and support were not there to say to those survivors, you know what, I think you might have PTSD. I think you might have severe mental illness. You might have depression. You might have anxiety, you know. All of those things. There was virtually no support or resources for survivors for in that time, in that era, when you were coming out of that. Especially, you know, in a society where how many people even knew that was happening to our people, right? Everything was sort of underground, you know. So because those resources and support weren't there, people found ways to cope, and many of them were unhealthy. And that's where we get into the whole slew of intergenerational impacts and effects, right? Is just living through that experience and being parented by someone who just had no skills to parent, and creating that cycle. It becomes a cycle of unhealthy parenting skills that just perpetuates on and on and on until someone is finally able to stand up and break that cycle and say, no, I want something different, right? And to learn. But it's like a baby. You have to learn and teach yourself healthy coping skills, because you know what? We're always going to have some sort of trauma, loss, or grief, anger, you know, fear. The world is highly far from perfect. But it's like now we have coping skills. Now we have resources. Now we have support so that we don't have to rely on unhealthy coping skills to get through things, that we can, help to build ourselves back up. And that's where that resilience piece comes in that I talked about earlier, I think in module 2, is that a lot of that is coming back because we are having to do, I'm going into the next phase, which is decolonization, right? To even, you'll see in some of these videos, where these people are grown adults, and for the first time ever, they're hearing their mother story about how they went to residential school and the impact it had on her. And this adult child didn't have a clue, didn't know, because the mom was so deeply impacted by that she could never speak of it in public. And I've heard many testimonials and many videos and done a lot of research on survivors, and that's a very common story, that the person that survived, like with PTSD, if you think of a veteran or maybe a paramedic, police, anyone that is repeatedly exposed to high levels of trauma, when they come out, they're shell-shocked, right? They don't have that ability to sometimes even recall what happened. Or if they do recall, it's deeply locked within their psyche, and they can't access that because of the volume of pain and the volume of anguish that it caused them and hurt, right? Particularly around trauma, like if there was any issues around sexual abuse or physical abuse, humiliation was huge within those schools, the shaming, all of those incidents are highly emotionally charged. And so how can that person be expected to parent when they can barely function, right? And so to have that conversation with their child as they're growing up, to say, you know what, my son or my daughter, I went here and this is what happened to me, I'm sure there are probably some people that were able to do that, but many, many people were not. And even to this day, it's common to hear stories that says, oh, my grandpa went to the mush hole, and he will, he never talks about it. We just know he went, but he won't talk about it. Or, my grandma went there and just doesn't talk about it, right? So that's the level that we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. It's highly, highly traumatic. So, but what came from that is when you have these adult children who hear those stories is reclaiming, reclaiming that historical past, to even like become educated and aware that this was part of Canada's history, and to give that onus back to Canada, to give it back to the government, to give it back to the state, to say, you know what, this shame belongs to you. It does not belong to my people, because this was a forced imposition on my people and a deliberate assault on our children and our families. And to just lift that shame off of them and to give themselves a chance to move forward without that is huge empowerment and huge healing and letting go and being able to reclaim their culture, and hopefully, and whatever that means to them, because culture can mean different things to many different people, and we're so regional as nations, right? The Haudenosaunee is only one. We're only one territory. We're only 6 nations out of hundreds across Canada. They're all different, and so for us, that culture means something very different than if you're Anishinaabe, if you're Cree, if you're Blackfoot, if you're Mi'kmaq, if you're, from Wet'suwet'en, from the west, depending on your territory, you're going to have that resurgence to your culture, to your land, to your community, to your people, to your songs, to your language, right? And that's that awakening piece that is so empowering and resilient within us. And that's the exciting phase that we're in right now. So it's actually that feeling of coming full circle, right? And exciting, but there's also the awareness that sometimes that there's a lack of movement within the systems that try to oppress Indigenous people, and it didn't work because by their standards we should all be dead, or all be good little Canadians by now. We should not still be practicing our languages or ceremonies or doing anything like that prevents us from being civilized in their mind. So that didn't work. Their plan didn't work. So now you have these systems in 2018 that are sitting back and trying to determine what are the next steps, that's what I mean. It's very interesting to see what will happen in the future, right? Because we also have Indigenous people now who were raised in this strong traditional way in their communities, with their language, with their ceremonies, and they've gone off and infiltrated into these various systems of education and infiltrated into academia, and going off to be professional people within these larger systems that once try to oppress and colonize us, right? So there's such a movement for change on the horizon, and for some of these systems the potential to collapse and to reform, right? I mean, that to me is very exciting because it can be potentially chaos, but then it can rebuild itself into something that is more inclusive, and not with just Indigenous people, but also with new people coming into our country. We have a high immigrant population. We have LGBTQ, so many people that have similar hurts and pains and histories of being excluded and looked down upon, right? Let's make that more inclusive for everyone. So that's the phase that we're in now. So a brief historical timeline of colonization. Because I'm narrating this, I'm not really going to get into a lot of this. It's quite repetitive. One thing I didn't mention is role modeling through mentoring and the role of elders. That's something that, again, we've had that disconnection from, because when our systems, especially our family system, when that was intact and we were living together in villages and longhouses, and we were living with the head matriarch of our entire clan system, right? So many families, but living together in one longhouse. But the oldest woman out of all those families, she was in charge, right? So if you had things there were just so many checks and balances within that society, right? You had aunties, you had grandmothers, you had sisters, you had wives, like sister-in-laws, and you had all these women that were helping to take care of that entire society. So if you were, because we're matrilineal, if you were a man coming into this village of, say, Bear Clan people, not going to be a lot of room for that male coming into that system to cause a lot of harm or damage, right? Because those women make sure that that family runs smoothly. And if the women don't do it, then that head matriarch, you better believe she is going to do it. Keep things in line, because that's how that family system was structured. so that everybody was there. There were checks and balances. Everybody had a role. Everybody had a purpose. And we took care of one another. It wasn't just a nuclear family. So within that comes the role modeling. That's how we learn our role. That's how we learn our place, is by seeing and by doing and being in action every day. We're taught how to do the things that we need to do. Mentoring, if we have a child that was born and that child all of a sudden starts to grow up, and you recognize that boy's a good hunter, or that girl she knows how to speak really well. Her words are really powerful. She's a good orator. You know what? That boy that was a good hunter, he's maybe all of a sudden allowed to go with some young men who are not really quite adult males yet, but they're young men coming to be a man, and maybe those young men can start to mentor that little boy, because they see something within him, and they know, okay, this is what I was taught. And then when that boy that's that gifted hunter gets to be a young man, he already has all that training that those young men give him. So he can move quicker into being an adult, because he's gifted and he's skilled at being a hunter. And so they train him up to be that way. And same way with that woman who is a good orator, good speaker. She is sent to talk to different people, different ones who also have that gift of language and speaking, and she's raised up that way. And so that's what that mentoring process is. We look for those gifts that are inherent within our children, and that's something that we lost within that time period of disturbance that we had. I have other impacts of colonization as well. I don't want to get too much into it, mainly because of time. Wars and disease, alcohol, residential school, CAS 60 scoop, all of those things are really, really important. And again, it's the Reader's Digest version, so I'm just going to mention that there. I'm not really going to get into a lot of detail with it. Very condensed version of colonization. So the purpose of the schools, again, I'm getting you to look at the broader picture here, because sometimes when folks are first starting to learn about these schools, they don't quite have the whole picture, and they don't quite have the whole understanding of a common thing I've heard is, why that happened so long ago, why don't they just get over it? That's very common. They don't understand the context and how things flowed together, and it's just there's a big misconnection there, right? So by putting this in here, this was written by one of our local scholars, Bev Jacobs, and she's pretty amazing. I believe she's working at University of Windsor right now. I would also encourage you to look up some of her research, because she's doing some great work. So this is taken from her master's thesis, I believe, and it's just going to give you a little bit of context on the purpose of these schools, the residential schools. So she's specifically talking here about the Mush Hole, or the Mohawk Institute. It became an institution for civilization in which Haudenosaunee children would learn the acts, habits, and customs of civilized life, who acted as instruments in the hands of the. By the year 1960, the Mohawk Institute was considered a success based on the number of students who became civilized. They became so civilized that they were taught how not to be Ongwehonwe, that means the real people, the original people in Cuga, that their traditions and practices were immoral, that their languages were of no purpose or importance, and therefore were forced to learn English. The mush hole continued to exist until the late 1960s. over 125 years, 5 or 6 generations. When I read that last sentence, it really impacted me because I just thought of the amount of control that an outside agency and body had over our people without us having a say. This was imposed by force upon us, and we had no say for 5 or 6 generations. It just blew my mind when I read that and put everything into context and perspective at the amount of damage that it caused to our people.
I got frightened when I was a little girl when the principal used to beat up the other children, like boys. The boys got the most beating. They used to call it bench party, and it was usually done after supper. And that's where I got frightened, because I saw blood.
I remember when we had to shower. You only have to show me how to shower and clean and wash myself, how to wash my private and private parts of your body. You only have to show a kid once or twice at the most, but not every day. And have the supervisor come in there and basically take advantage of you.
I just remember arriving there and donning new clothes and, of course, getting a haircut and sitting in a classroom and being with other girls and witnessing my brother get punched by the supervisor.
My name is Alice Little Deer. I'm 78 years old. I spent about 8 years in residential school.
My name is Raymond Mason. I'm 62 years old, and I attended residential school for 12 years.
I'm Madeline Dion Stout. I'm 62 years old. I'm from the Kihiwan First Nation in Alberta. I attended Blue Quills Residential School for 36 consecutive months. That would be 3 years.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
I remember them taking me away from my mother and my stepfather. And I can hear them telling my mom that that was the best thing for me. And that not to worry, I would be looked after.
Our parents didn't want to worry us unduly and tell us and warn us that we are going to be separated for a long, long time with barely a visit.
I see him come around, Indian agent in a boat, with the principal, then collect some children from the reserve. Mm-hmm. Then he would come back again, come and take some more.
So the next day, I woke up with hundreds of total strangers, my size, my age, and not knowing, what are they doing with all of us here? Why are there's so many of us here, and that's where a lot of my whole life really started to change, because I got strapped, I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched,
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6. I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter is dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
At that time, they never told us that our sisters were across the hallway. And I didn't know that for the longest time. Then I spotted my sister, Nora, and I was so glad and so hysteric, and I went running to her and I reached onto her, and just hugged her, and I was just shaking, like, and terrified. And I was wondering why she was pushing me away. I didn't realize that we weren't supposed to know that we both lived in the same place, and we weren't allowed to speak to each other. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. And I can remember the principal grabbing a hold of me by the hand, and I was jumping off the floor like that, and he stripped me. And he started whacking me with a long webbed strap. He was setting an example that, if you do this, is what's going to happen to you. And all the other boys were watching, and the girls were still going through,
Their education must consist not merely training of the mind, but of a weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors and the acquirements of the language, art, and customs of civilized life. Edgerton Ryerson, 1847 Report for Indian Affairs.
Visits from my parents were very rare, but I do recall one visit when my mother and father came. And I remember specifically my mother's red tam, that splash of color. I remember her getting out of the wagon, and I was crying already watching them because I was missing them already. They hadn't even walked through the door yet of the residential school, but I was missing them already. And when they were actually leaving, I cried until my nose bled.
And you learn pretty quick after getting those kind of beatings. Not strapping, it's literally beatings, And ever since that day, I tried to run away. And I made friends with a guy by the name of Donald Atkinson from Rosa River First Nation. And we planned, to take off. And when we got caught, we paid for dearly, Not only did the RCMP give us a licking, but the bigger boys that was helping them chase us down.
Were you angry at your parents that they made you go to school?
Sometimes I would think about them. I get mad for all giving me here, sending me over there where all the bad treatment is. And
Tell me how you felt when you saw your children go to that school.
well, I felt sad. My first two boys went, and then a couple of years after, the next two boys went, and so on, as they got older, yeah. I told them to be strong. I had always told them to be strong, to be able to take it like the other children.
So you sent 11 kids to residential school? How many of them do you think were strong through that?
None of them. None of them.
What about your children? How do you think it affected them being in residential
Well,
school?
like I said, a little bit crazier than before they went to school. Their mind was a little bit more intact, staying at home with us. They knew how to hunt ducks, and they knew how to fish, and they knew how to snare rabbits and pick blueberries. Today you don't see that.
And you think that's the school?
Yeah. everything destroyed in our world. We didn't bother white people. White people bothered me.
Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. Nicholas Flood David Report, 1879.
There are three reasons why I think residential schools are a blot on the Canadian landscape. One is that we became strangers in our home and native land. Two is that nurturing relationships between parents and children were severed. Residential schools were a frontal attack on parenthood. Three is that it added to our mental stress in a very real way.
My name is Michael Loft. I'm from Ganawagi. I'm 55 years old, okay, and my dad attended residential school for 11 continuous years in Spanish Ontario. He says, and once he told me a story where they were so bored, they were in I think the cafeteria, and they would just walk in a circle, you know, because they couldn't just go run around, you know, willy-nilly all over the residential school just because school was out. They had to be controlled, I guess, had to be contained, and so they would walk in circles, you know, in the cafeteria, round and round and round and round, to deal with their boredom.
My name's Lorena Fontaine. I'm 38 years old, and both my parents and grandparents went to residential school. I was at a conference that my mom was speaking at. She was giving the keynote address, and she started talking about her residential school experience during her speech. And and that's how I found out. Well, I was, of course, I was shocked and appalled, and I just felt so terrible for her. I felt frozen when I was listening to her. And it wasn't until after she finished speaking that I started thinking about our family life. I started thinking about the abuse that was very prevalent when I was a child. And I started putting connections together.
He never knew when he was going to get hit in residential school. That's the thing. So he lived like in fear of getting hit. You break a rule, you get whacked, you know. So it was unpredictable, you know. You couldn't, you could try to learn the rules as best as you could, but I mean, you're a kid, you know, you'd mess up and whack, you know. So there was that unpredictability that he brought home too. And the same thing with us. We didn't know what was going to happen, you know, next. So it was scary.
I was raised by parents who never had a childhood, and they didn't have any parents as role models. So we were vulnerable children. And a lot of us were abused ourselves as young children. And I also realized at that point that one of the people who abused me in my family had been a residential school survivor, a family member. And I understood why now, why I was abused.
The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and to assimilate the Indian people in all respects. Sir John A. Macdonald, May 2nd, 1887.
He got out, you know, like everybody gets out at 16, and he eventually made his way to Aguizasne, to his home, and he told me that he couldn't connect with them. He couldn't connect because he couldn't speak the language. He didn't understand the culture. So he couldn't take it, you know. He was frustrated. He was going nowhere. So he went back to the residential school for one more year because it seemed like that was home now. That was home. And that's where he could, you know, they spoke his language, and so that's where he went.
I grew up not knowing my language, and in fact, I kind of felt a bit ashamed about our language and our identity, because it seemed like they were, meaning my parents and my aunts and uncles, were ashamed too in some way, because they didn't want to talk about it and they didn't want to share with us about who we were.
There was a lot of fear. I think the fear that they put in him, the terror that they put in him. I mean, he managed to bring that with him, and it went into our family, you know. And I learned terror and fear and all that as well as a child. I put fear in my sons too. That's all I knew, you know. When they were doing something that was right, I would put fear in them, you know.
Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, January 1st, 1920.
Generally, the survivors of residential school do not commit suicide any more than the general population. Okay. It's the children of the residential school survivors who commit suicide in incredibly high numbers. You know, 6 to 7 times, you know, the provincial average. Okay.
It might just take one person to start talking about it, or perhaps a family to start talking about the fact that there is abuse, and the reason why there's that abuse is because of the residential school experience. That, you know, we're not abusive people by trade. We're not, we weren't born that way. And to be able to, I think families need to be able to realize that they're not alone, that none of us are alone anymore, that we have each other, and that it's okay to start talking about it.
We don't have the monopoly on pain and hurt, but we have and have carried a disproportionate share of it over time. And I would really like us to move forward, not to erase our memory of who we are, because residential school is certainly a part of who we are. I'd like us all to be a part of a team that really makes a lasting difference for not only residential school survivors, but the other little children who are having difficulties today.
Yeah, so everybody just needs to take some deep breaths. Like I say, we talk about some of these things, and when we really see the first-hand testimonials and the stories, the impacts, it's very heavy and it's very real. So we can just kind of take some deep breaths and disconnect from that. So if you want to learn more about that full story there, because there was more information on this page. It was like a whole page of stories and resources, and you could more videos, so it's there on the website. So again, I'm going to be talking about how is this a systemic approach to education? What systems were involved? Obviously, it's the government, the church, and the education. That's why I included this particular video, because it has the quotes of various people of authority that were in charge at the time. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs, Sir John A. Macdonald. You know, they were leaders at the time, you know, of the government. and they were representatives of that state that were involved in making those critical decisions in how our people were treated. And again, with the church and that imposition of religion being the ultimate path to civilization, again, something that was imposed upon us against our will to indoctrinate us with something that outsiders felt was better for us, that if we accepted that way of life, that we would then become civilized, right? And really, it was just imposing power and control, which is ultimately colonization. Education, because again, that was a system that to this day is run by the government, and I talked a little bit about that with Doug Ford and the lack that continues to exist in 2018 in denying that opportunity for our students to know the true narrative of Canadians' history and Indigenous people. Denied with a big rubber stamp by Doug Ford. So that's pretty, I don't know what that is. It's not something that I agree with. And we need your strength in numbers allies to support things like this that you hear about in the news, in the media, to do the research, to hold those systems accountable, right? To challenge, because in 2018 there's less and less opportunity for us to be controlled, right? We have more and more opportunity to state our position, our voice, and to have our power to say, no, we are not accepting this. This is not something that we aspire to, however you want to educate and, to make your voice heard, is we need all of that advocacy to ensure that this never happens again in Canada, for one thing, and for your own personal reasons as well. I mean, I think that all society deserves that equitable treatment, right? And again, I mentioned other populations that have felt similar marginalization throughout Canada. Like, there's no, it's not exclusive. It is exclusive. It's not inclusive when we have people on the outside looking in and saying, oh, I wonder what that's about over there, and they're not made to feel welcome or left out, right? So why is this important? Why is it important that I keep telling you about systems? Because they all had the same goal, right? And it's that ultimately it's that power and control to ensure. Their goal was the church, the government, and the education system. Their goal was to ensure the assimilation process, and it's well documented. There is so much information on this topic. If you wanted to Google any of those names of those leaders that came up in the video, you'll see the genocidal policies. It's well documented. The intent was the elimination of our distinct culture. Beliefs were entrenched within the systems themselves based on power and control. So again, very deeply psychological process that, we want to be done with this Indian problem, quote unquote, so that the government did no longer have to deal with us after that. We would be absorbed into the bigger society and they would no longer be responsible for us. That was the ultimate goal. And again, like I mentioned earlier, surprise, surprise, it did not work. So now what are we going to do today in 2018? This is part, again, where we need the strong voice of allies and support to stand with us and to educate themselves and to say, no, this is what we want as Canadians, So I think that's a really important piece as well. Who is Duncan Campbell Scott? I'm not going to get too much into this because we went through it just briefly. Canadian, he was a civil servant, deputy superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932, so right during the height of that residential school era. Known today for advocating the assimilation and genocide of Indigenous people in Canada. Again, very well documented. If you Google him, there is a lot of information, a lot of documents, things that he's written. He was actually a poet as well. Yeah, so it's all there, and I encourage you to do some further research on this. And again, here's one of his famous quotes: "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that hasn't been absorbed into the body politic." So quite clear what their overall vision was for Indigenous people.
A young boy trying to escape. It was 1966 when Chani Wenjack ran away from a residential school. His body was found near railroad tracks a week later. He was only 12. A New Heritage Minute tells his story through the voice of his sister Pearl.
I survived residential school. My brother Johnny did not.
For John Custer, watching it brings back painful memories of his own experience.
Many times boys would run away, the girls would run away, and if we were caught, they would shave our heads and beat the hell out of you.
Custer was one of more than 150,000 children forced to attend residential school in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's now part of a group that holds an annual reunion for survivors and their families. He believes there are still people who don't fully know what really happened.
It was a reality. For me, it's nice to talk about it once in a while to get rid of it.
The Minute was written by Canadian author Joseph Boyden.
Seeing that little boy on the railroad track dead because he went to a school that that were supposed to give him an education is very disturbing.
They forced him to go to the Indian residential school.
Doris Young was a member of an advisory committee with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and spent years in residential school. She says while this might help educate, she would prefer to see something positive launch on Aboriginal Day.
We're supposed to be out there dancing and making, telling our children what wonderful people they are.
For Historica Canada, it's important to recognize all parts of Canadian history to move forward.
Only by understanding those mistakes, those things we've done poorly in our history, those things of which we're less proud, do we improve as a country.
In 1966, Chani Wenjack's death triggered the first inquest into the treatment of students at residential schools, but his family wasn't allowed to attend. Alana Cole, CBC News, Winnipeg.
So again, Chani Wenjack, that was that fellow's name I spoke about earlier, and this was his story. So that was the main point that stuck out with me, is that his death again sparked that first inquest into the treatment of our people in residential schools. And there's more information there on that link as well if you wanted to look that up. Interesting enough, the little boy who played Chani in the video, he goes to a school today, that's my friend's son, and he goes to the Everlasting Tree School, which is a Waldorf-based school at Six Nations that's taught in Mohawk. So he talks about that experience, and it was a really good learning experience for him and helped him to identify how lucky he is to have had that chance to learn his language and be involved in things. So I just want to add that little story. So now if you're listening, this is a little bit about me as well, my contact information. I'm at mthomas@grchc.ca. We are over on Colburn Street, and that's my phone number there if you need to contact me for anything. The services available that I provide are cultural safety training such as this, and with that I really work to tailor to meet the needs of your organization, whether it's training within your staff, volunteers, management, or board. We can work together to develop something that's going to best suit you. I offer support to individuals pertaining to Indigenous issues, such as anyone that has a particular case that they are working on where they are trying to support an Indigenous person and they really need that guidance and that connection to, maybe they need some support people, some more additional resources, some knowledge keepers that can really help to gain support and advocacy for their client. Or if you are an Indigenous person, maybe living in Brantford, new to Brantford, just arriving here from another community, and you really need to have that connection to, our local Indigenous community, being Six Nations or New Credit, I can help to connect you with some individuals to support you as well. Another aspect of what I do is education. We will be hosting 3 conferences in the upcoming calendar year. We have one set for October 25th. That's going to be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and youth engagement. So we're going to be looking at some of those recommendations and getting youth involved, really just engaging them to think about some of those aspects of the TRC. January 31st, we're going to be doing a conference on colonization. In March, I don't have working with a partner on this one. I'm working with Laurier, so we don't have the date set yet for that one, but it'll be intergenerational impacts and beyond. So again, throughout the year, I'm required to do these pieces that, again, are bridging those gaps and helping to create better relationships between Indigenous folks and others that are wanting to make life a little bit better. Now if you're listening, and take care.